Hello.
Our story begins in transit to Naboo, inside the Senator's glimmering starship. Padme and Anakin had spent about a full day together on Coruscant before making a rash decision to abandon the capital. The two lovers had been separated for months, and upon their reunion there was growing tension. Both were stressed, the whole situation with their new child, and of course, there was the end of the war that was lurking over them. They hadn't gotten into an intense exchange about politics yet, but they were being plagued by the onset of external influence. The issue for Padme, at the moment, was her struggles with the delegation members. She, Mon Mothma, and Bail Organa were responsible for the first steps into building a coalition to stand against the impossibly powerful Chancellor. But the issue is, at least for Padme, things weren't going in a positive direction. She was overworking herself as a pregnant woman, and sure, that meant something in regard to honor, but truthfully, it wasn't worth it anymore. She needed to rest herself because these cohorts of hers weren't pushing themselves to stand up to Palpatine as much as she was. These were behind-the-scenes discussions that Anakin wasn't necessarily privy to. In an unhealthy manner, Padme needed to walk on eggshells when it came to addressing Anakin's friend, because he couldn't see the damage he was actively doing to the Republic. Anyhow, Padme didn't want to be around the toxicity of Republic politics. The previous night, she suggested that they return to Naboo, and after an understanding and mature conversation, she and Anakin agreed to leaving Coruscant. Padme, the following morning, addressed the Jedi Council, and they were forced to oblige because they couldn't rely on Ahsoka to do this mission for them, and Master Kenobi was necessary for something else. It also wasn't like they could explain to the Senator that they were actively spying on the Chancellor with Anakin, regardless of her position's stance towards Palpatine. On the other side of things, Anakin had the entire drama of the High Council, and the Chancellor doing his head in. He felt morally wrong for standing against his friend, which isn't something he wanted to do. In his weird predicament, he was serving on the Council as a member without the rank of Master, and waiting ever so eagerly for the secret mission to spy on Palpatine to end. Getting away from Coruscant would be the best thing for him, because he wouldn't need to completely dismantle his relationship with Palpatine. The situation was sticky, and just getting away from it would alleviate some unnecessary pressure. More or less, for the two of them, this was a vacation away from their problems, so that they could deal with a completely different set of them. Their trip through hyperspace would be quite nice though. They didn't talk much, but they watched a couple of movies and enjoyed each other's company, which was much more enjoyable than trying to rush things. Though the important conversation for them was their grievances with abandoning their responsibilities. Anakin may have disagreed with spying on Palpatine, but it was his duty. Padme had an entirely different assortment of them, among which was loyalty to her constituents. In all fairness, to herself, she'd been putting her life on the line ever since she became a senator. She was sure that people would be understanding if she did a month or so of work from home. The unspoken thing that remained present on their minds while being in hyperspace was whether or not they should go public with their relationship. It was a very important step, but for the moment there was no reason to stress themselves out more. Just keep it simple stupid until they knew what they wanted to do with the whole war thing and everything else. Upon their return to Naboo, they would head straight for the villa where they planned on raising the singular child. You know, sometimes it doesn't hurt to get an ultrasound. Thanks to the vast wealth held by the Nabaris, it was very easy to acquire more buildings for the secret couple. Anakin and Padme would spend their time with their favorite family members before catching some rest. Anakin and Padme's dad, as she and Solo would talk by the water. It was very nice, and just what both of them needed. One doesn't realize how stuffy the air is on Coruscant until they get to Lake Como, Space Italy. The following day would be all about shopping and building little things, and yelling at IKEA instructions because you were sitting on the part that you were looking for, and so on. It was great fun. They'd also do some painting in the room, because nothing's healthier for a pregnancy than huffing spray paint. Back on Coruscant, the Jedi had to course correct. Palpatine was forced to tell the Jedi about Grievous's location by using a clone commander, which would dispatch Kenobi to Utapau. But the issue remained. Firstly, where was Anakin, and how did Palpatine want to go forward with his plans? Obviously, Anakin had to go and vanish off to Naboo, which only annoyed Palpatine. He was furious, actually. It was incredibly hard to use his dream manipulation from across the galaxy, not to mention, what was he going to do about Order 66? Well, Sidious was a brilliant master manipulator, and he planned to play the even longer game. He recognized that he wouldn't necessarily need Skywalker on his side to win, but he couldn't help but consider the possibility of a dynasty of apprentices. He was just given the information he needed. If Padme was truly pregnant and they were hiding on Naboo, then he would let them. In a scenario where he properly seduced Skywalker, maybe even turning him against Padme, then he could have the child and the father, which created a legacy of loyalty that could protect him from the meddling of the Force. It would try and undermine him, because he used the dark side. This could be his opportunity to guard himself from the Force. So while wholesome activities were taking place a galaxy away, the Clone Wars came to an end. The Jedi were able to defeat General Grievous and win across various battlefronts. Each division of clones celebrated, and the Confederacy officially surrendered. Not to mention, the Council would be captured by Kenobi's forces, again thanks to Palpatine's direction. On the outside, this seemed like a really stupid idea, but Palpatine made one counter after another, because he wanted to ensure Skywalker's turn to darkness as well. Anakin was dormant and stationed away from the galaxy. Before he left the capital, he was frustrated with the Jedi Council, meaning those feelings would likely remain with him until something changed, but he wouldn't allow it to come to that. Yet what Palpatine couldn't fully predict was the Jedi move. He knew they were going to do something, but not what they did. After securing victory with several well-known Jedi Masters serving on the front lines of the Outer Rim sieges, they were able to publicly celebrate their victories with their troopers. For Masters like Mundi, they simply commemorated the event, while others would pop bottles of champagne for their men. It was a time of celebration, and Palpatine made sure that the Separatists surrendered. With Maul and the CIS Council captured, there was no need for the war to continue, which Sidious oversaw. In the following week, the Jedi would make a move for the Senate, and suggest that Palpatine step down from his seat for controlling too much of the Republic, without needing to have an individual with such emergency powers in a time of peace. Surprisingly, even to Palpatine, the Republic Senate would accept these terms. Euphoria stretched across the lines of victors. They won, so why not? What difference did it make? The Senate had an unspoken agreement about Palpatine being their wartime leader. With war over, completely over, no need to stand on ceremony. They should focus on economic prosperity, and while many saw Palpatine as a successful chancellor, they needed someone else to take the reins so that the former CIS worlds could join without as much animosity. Though this is exactly what Palpatine wanted. He never thought the Jedi proposal would gain traction, but he did expect the Senate to suggest moving on from him. It wasn't hostile or anything, they just saw the need for economic expansion, and his emergency powers weren't necessarily needed for a time of peace. This action came from the desire to maintain a good relationship with the systems that would be joining their coalition again. This potentially included neutral planets like Mandalore, which the Senate was thirsting over, especially after breaking the treaty and having clones stationed on the system. So, Palpatine celebrated his victory by openly stepping down from his role as Chancellor and openly accepting retirement, though his calculated effort wouldn't be fully realized immediately. Just like his future apprentice, Palpatine planned on taking some much-needed vacation time for himself. Out on Naboo, Padme and Anakin were still waiting for the child to be born, and in the process they were discussing Palpatine stepping down, including the Jedi who suggested it. Anakin felt like it was a betrayal of the Chancellor, but the family that embraced him planted ideas into his mind. They weren't going to force Anakin's hand in changing his opinion, but they offered an alternative way to seeing his mentor. They all knew how close the two of them were, thanks to Palpatine's interest in him as a child, which, by the way, Padme's parents found really weird. They respected Anakin's opinion, but gave him the chance to see both sides of the story, and why people like Padme often opposed the former Chancellor. Anakin was, during this time, able to spend time with his partner outside the villa. It was always beautiful here on Naboo, so of course they'd be outside. The two of them, during a lunch by the beach, would talk about the mission Anakin was assigned to. The Jedi Knight was burdened by it, and he needed to tell someone. Padme was very understanding of his issues with it, and offered support. She didn't disagree with the Order's decision, but she was glad that Anakin was removed from the situation. It would have made things uncomfortable for Anakin, which even further reinforced her happiness with them removing themselves from the core. Something that became abundantly clear in the time they spent together on Naboo is how much they needed to work on themselves. They were always separated, and about to be parents. They had some minor things to work through, and due to their distance they never had the chance to do it. This wasn't even a critique at their current position, because they both agreed to it. They had so much reconnecting to do, and now without distance being a factor, they could evolve their relationship. The Jedi, the Senate, the war weren't bothering them, so they had time to do this. They had their own respective reports to fill out, but it wasn't the worst situation ever because they were working from home. Ahsoka would also visit during this time, because she wanted to personally inform Anakin that she had rejoined the Jedi Order after capturing Maul. She would also be the one to tell him that he would be promoted to the rank of Jedi Master for finishing his mission. What that meant, Ahsoka didn't really know, but the new Jedi Knight would happily leave Naboo, knowing that her master was finally what he always wanted to be, a Jedi Master on the High Council. Though as the days following Palpatine's removal from his seat of power, he started to make connections with Anakin. This started with basic calls to make sure he hadn't done anything to upset his friend. The first step in manipulation is guilt. Now Skywalker was worried that he had made his friend upset or even hurt him, but that wasn't the case, so Palpatine continued with his own manipulation tactics, such as talking about the betrayal of the Jedi and guilting Skywalker, quote-unquote, unintentionally. Palpatine would say that he was deeply hurt that the Jedi wanted him gone, and he was grateful that Anakin never turned his back on him. The friendship from his young friend was greatly appreciated. The issue for Anakin was that every time he started to slip away from Palpatine, he would wrap his hands back around Anakin and pull him in. Now Skywalker, waiting patiently for the arrival of a potential Luke or a potential Leia, would grapple with ideals. The Nibiris were right, but then Palpatine was a victim. It was a lot to process and a lot to think about. On the galactic level, Palpatine's plans were coming together. Despite winning the war and defeating the Separatists, which also included new systems entering the Republic again, the government and economy were shifting towards a recession. This was because the Senate never considered how important Palpatine was. The former Chancellor, now replaced by another core-bred politician, had control over the entire credit line for the Republic. This came following the entire situation at Scipio with Rush Clovis. Thanks to the Republic not trusting the banking clans, the power was given to Palpatine, and he never really gave it back. He may have walked away without fighting or standing up for himself, but they didn't have the means to control the credit line that the banking clans, then Palpatine, had so much clear power over. It's because Palpatine was basically running the clans from behind the scenes prior to publicly actually doing it. But there were constant issues springing up for the victorious Republic, aside from the recession. The public was annoyed because the Separatists weren't being treated with any sort of hostility. Despite what the Senate wanted, the public wanted something else, because, clones weren't performing martial law. Actually, come to think of it, clones weren't really present on any CIS worlds anyways. They won the war and bounced, which made people unsure if they could trust the government without Palpatine in it. He made the system run on him, and without the anchor, it slowly fell apart, and he just watched from the outside. The recession obviously hurt, but it was the fact that Republic citizens couldn't at least use the former CIS to get their anger out. It wasn't like, oh, the CIS has martial law, so it could be worse. It was more or less the fact that they were all suffering, and now the CIS was sort of in the same boat with them, which just felt wrong to many people. Palpatine played this up until the inflection point. He was watching the people of the Republic for decades, and he knew when they would tick. When the moment came, he utilized a Federation and Union board member. It was a Skakoan with a lot of influence in both now crumbling empires. A coward at heart with no military expertise, which is why he was getting the reins. Palpatine gave this man a way out, and he took it. It came with the cost of betraying the CAS Council and watching all of his friends get locked up. Vulu Vant was his name, and he was promoted to Supreme Commander of the Separatist Warforce. These were rebels of the CIS, and they would utilize the Separatist Reserve Military. It hadn't been touched because the Republic didn't know about it, and Palpatine was waiting to get his use out of it. Right before the protests could take over the Republic, shock filled the air across the galaxy, as a Separatist force whooped a Republic fleet. The Senate was working on a clone retirement bill, something Padme was doing from home, and now the clones had to go back into the galaxy for war. At this point, Padme and Anakin had been on Naboo for about a month, and she was just about to give birth. As it turns out, being force-choked on a sulfur-based planet isn't healthy for pregnancy. Save the force chokes for non-pregnant activities, you know? She had submitted the proposal and gone into a grueling labor when the Republic was hit. Anakin was left in shock, and his friend Palpatine tried to call him, but he didn't answer. During this whole situation, Palpatine had been in one ear with the Nibiru's in the other. It was a constant back and forth that kept spinning Anakin's mind in circles. Not exactly the greatest thing ever. On Coruscant, but also across the core, millions of people took to the streets to protest the restart of the war. It was made abundantly clear that former separatist systems did not support the attack, but Republic citizens didn't care. It was time for total war, total destruction, and a politician who could promise them that security. They called upon Palpatine to return to the seat of Chancellor. These protests started very quickly, and gained traction even faster. As this happened, the Jedi and the Senate came together to discuss these protests in quiet. The new Chancellor didn't believe they needed to rebuild their government around Palpatine again. They wanted to stop this rebel movement and restructure the government. It had become abundantly clear to members of the Senate in the months since the end of the war that they'd given too much power over to Sheev. He had control over too much, and they struggled to really gain that control back. They'd worked arduously on finally putting the pieces back together, and just days away from finalizing an agreement that would save the economy from a total depression, the rebels struck. Can't you see why Palpatine was waiting so patiently? He wanted everything, not just the role of Emperor. Skywalker was almost in his circle, and now the war was restarting. The people of the Republic were in his pockets. Yet there was an unanticipated change. The Jedi, despite serving with the clones for the last 3 years, would not be joining the war again. There was a quick action from the Jedi Council to the attack made by Supreme Commander Font. But there were Jedi protests, which started with Ahsoka. She refused to remain in an order that continued to chase battle. Instead, because she recognized that this wasn't a governmental movement, that they needed to focus on humanitarian efforts to shift public opinion on them for being warmongers during the past 3 years. The Council truly couldn't disagree with the protests inside of their own temple, so they sided with Ahsoka and her people. And this was communicated to the Chancellor. This domino effect would absolutely land Palpatine back in control over the Republic. The sitting Chancellor could not stand up to Palpatine or the protests, because he didn't have a backbone, ironically just like the Separatist attacker. But without the Jedi in his corner, he would cave immediately to the pressure, and as a result, the Jedi Order frustratedly watched Palpatine rise again. Protests immediately stopped, as people thought that he would rescue them again, and like he did with the Clone War, the Republic would start winning battles, without the Jedi. But there was a problem in that. Because the Jedi weren't militarized anymore, their immediate efforts to help rebuild broken systems took blame away from them. People were angry, and as it turns out, they were angry at the system. So Sidious needed another counter to make sure the Jedi were a force to be loathed by the populace. Ahsoka's outspoken position both helped the Jedi, but hurt them too. Luckily, at the moment, despite Palpatine being Supreme Chancellor and balancing the economic situation, the Jedi were still viewed in a semi-positive light. Their commemorations at the end of the official war a month before did a lot of PR work for them. Palpatine returning inadvertently helped boost popularity of the Jedi, because people saw that the combined strength of the Jedi and the Chancellor were necessary for total success, and that pissed Palpatine off more than anything else. Back on Naboo, away from the war and the political squabbling, were a happy set of parents and twins. Instead of just getting a son or a daughter, they were gifted both. This made them incredibly happy, but they also needed to do some remodeling inside of the baby's bedroom. Anakin would handle that, which he enjoyed because he and Rui, Padme's father, could have some more son and father-in-law bonding time. This included painfully building another set for the other twin. It was all good though, nothing would really take away the euphoria that existed in the air. Anakin at this point was happily considering leaving the Jedi Order. He didn't really have a point to remain a part of it, so why stay? He really saw that there wasn't a ton of value in remaining with the Order. Ahsoka was back, and he was still, technically a counselor, but he didn't feel called to return. The Council had been very accepting of his situation on Naboo. They didn't punish him for doing another mission, they just informed him that a temporary spot would fill in for him until he returned. That would be Depa Billaba, because she and Caleb were back from Kalar. Depa was hoping to get her student away from action for a little anyways, so it all worked out. Because Palpatine hadn't driven a total wedge between Padme and Anakin, he was forced to elongate this conflict. But the issue is, he had to do it without weakening his support, and also making the Jedi again look bad. That was the most impossible part about any of this. He couldn't just get the Jedi to be halted like they were before. It took 3 years of war, and another couple decades of complacency to do that effectively. Grand Inquisitor, or Violam, was a great asset who worked inside the temple, but he was no Tyrannus. The temple guard could be used for another temple bombing, but at this point in the war, it likely wouldn't be seen as an effective use of strength. Instead, he let Violam remove himself from the Order and break Barriss out of prison. They would go to the works and begin training his future Inquisitors. Because Sidious had them with him personally, he would train Violam, and thus the Grand Inquisitor could train Barriss. The issue, though, from what Palpatine could gather, is that Anakin wasn't going to be swayed that easily. This came from one main concern. The Nabaris were constantly whispering in his ears, and surely, as a new father, he would be happier than ever. Palpatine had gotten a few nightmares into his mind, but the love that surrounded Anakin, without the stress of anything else, really kept him grounded. His concerns were limited, and he thrived as a result. Sidious slowly started to regret not pulling Order 66 earlier, but he was patient. The long game worked out before, and it would work again here. He had obviously considered Maul, but there wasn't enough for him to do. Violam actually freed Maul from his sarcophagus before abandoning the temple, but he died pretty quickly, so nothing really came from it. The next several months would mimic this. Palpatine was able to at the very least maintain a peaceful populace by simply adhering to their requests. Martial law faced former CIS worlds, because these attacks came from formerly CIS military forces. The battles that continued simply broke down the reserve fleet, while Commander Vulu Vant played by Palpatine's rules. The Supreme Chancellor was able to make the Jedi look bad once, but they recovered after clearing up that it was a simple misunderstanding. It was a whole political thing where they were trying to help out people from the former Confederacy. It was spun by the media to make it look like they were trying to stop the martial law, not provide humanitarian relief due to a lockup on supply chains due to the attacks by Vulu Vant. Palpatine's plan worked, it just didn't work all the way, because the Jedi provided evidence that they weren't working against the Republic, they were just helping out people. It was a very hard line to walk, but because the recession was stopped when Palpatine cut the bill to disperse banking clan assets, he was heralded as a hero. However, Vulu Vant, despite being a known coward, started to get impatient. He decided that this game of fake cat and mouse was stupid, and after months of digging, he realized that Palpatine was Sidious, and the whole reason he was doing this was for more economic control or political power in the government. As a result, the figurehead decided to make Palpatine pay. He would lob a fleet at the Republic and decimate it, killing thousands of clones and civilians in the process. The people weren't pleased with this, and the weak Senate bumbled around, leading Palpatine to make a decision. He crowned himself as Emperor, to a thunderous applause from the people of the Republic. This on Naboo was quite the discussion. Anakin and Padme had been living relatively peacefully. There were some minor disagreements over the months with Palpatine's return, and honestly Anakin was getting sick of standing up for Palpatine, because at this point, it seemed like he did things in spite of the government. Padme was able to, thanks to her maternity leave, explain in great detail what Anakin was missing. It was really easy to discuss this, because as it turns out, twins could create a firestorm of waking you up in the middle of the night, and causing a great noise by doing so. So Anakin and Padme, when they couldn't go back to sleep, would engage in deep political discussions. Padme showed Anakin pre-Palpatine laws and regulations, and post-Federation ones, including some changes made throughout the Clone War. When it came time for Palpatine to become Emperor, Anakin was the first to call it a horrible action. Palpatine, in his mind, betrayed the responsibility of the Republic, and now, as an actual father, Anakin had to think about what Palpatine's rule would do to the galaxy that his children would grow up in. He couldn't let an autocratic leader tear down the establishment of the Republic because of his own desires for power. Anakin, as a result, decided to return to Coruscant to face his former friend in person and for the first time stand up to him verbally. Skywalker has spent the longer part of the last few months perfecting his saber skills. He was a force to be reckoned with, and he decided to threaten someone he had long considered a mentor, because something else had crossed Anakin's mind. He knew the Jedi were skeptical of Palpatine, but for what reason? Now Anakin had looked back at all the times Palpatine called him. Nearly every instance he had a call with Palpatine, he had an argument with his wife shortly after. It was like his friend was deliberately trying to cause a rupture in his marriage, and Anakin couldn't let that happen. When he eventually arrived on Coruscant, he interrupted something very important for his friend. Sidious had course-corrected nearly perfectly, and no one had caught on. Sidious was able to convince millions of people to join the future TK Stormtrooper Corps. These were going to replace the clones, and his plan to get rid of the Jedi was with a faulty act made by the clones. See, Palpatine had the chance to prove to the galaxy that taxpayer credits didn't need to go to Clone War veterans. If they say, acted out, then he could can the entire program, and the billions of credits meant to go to it. Therefore, he could create loyalty and gain even more support for the military without the clones. So he planned to execute Order 66, wipe out the Jedi, blame the clones and maybe even the Senate, shut down the CIS rebels, and then create the Stormtrooper Corps. It would be one swift strike after another, and sure, Skywalker was doing whatever, but he could be included in this plan later. So when Anakin walked in the door, Palpatine was actually hailing Commander Fox, and so he had to end his communique. He jumped up, welcoming Anakin back to the capital, and asking him how he was doing. Skywalker wasn't nearly as warm, as he told his former mentor that he wanted to speak to him about his position in the government. It was weird. Palpatine usually wasn't so off guard. Like typically he'd have a response lined up and everything, but he was caught flat-footed, and Anakin caught onto it before Sheev could raise his defenses. The two of them got into an elongated, boring political discussion, in which Palpatine would try and sway Anakin's opinion, so that he'd favor the current position, but it wouldn't work. Anakin eventually got tired of the back and forth, and stood up, igniting his saber. He pointed it at his friend and told him to give up. This had gone too far. The Sith Lord told the boy to point his decadent saber somewhere else, and Skywalker just grinned cockily, telling him to get up and leave. Palpatine did stand up, locking the doors behind Anakin with a twitch of his finger, and then igniting his own saber, as he leapt across the table and Skywalker was forced to defend himself. Their blades collided, and the Jedi Master adequately worked across the room. The training he did couldn't amount to actually fighting, but Skywalker was more graceful than he was back inside the invisible hand. Their blades slammed together, Sidious pressing, but Anakin using his physical strength to dominate Palpatine. Each strike was just as calculated as his attempt to bring Anakin into the darkness, to turn him against his beloved partner. Anakin slashed through a chair and then was thrown into a wall. He rose with exceptional speed and darted to the side, slashing back and cutting up a piece of Palpatine's robes. Sidious knew that if he captured the twins, then he wouldn't have to worry about any threat from the Force stopping him or his plans. However, these thoughts were a little externalized, when Skywalker could sense his children being in danger by the way Palpatine was looking at him. He realized what Palpatine was. After having fought him for a few minutes, it took some time, but Anakin was able to fully internalize what it was that he was fighting. This Sith Lord was trying to rip his family apart, and he couldn't allow that to happen. Their blades connected, and they held each other at arm's length apart, as Skywalker told Palpatine that he trusted him. Sidious scowled, telling the foolish boy that he would have been a much better ally if he hadn't been so headstrong. He would die knowing that his wife would die trying to save his kids. Anakin's sight turned red, and he shoved Palpatine back into the desk, gripping his saber and slamming down. But as he was doing that, he accidentally crushed his own saber in rage. Palpatine was surprised, but he grinned. Anakin was completely defenseless as he stepped back, protecting himself from every strike thrown his way. He batted Palpatine's weapon away from him, and as he did, he gripped his opponent's wrist. Sidious pulled his spare saber out of a nearby vase. Anakin could hear it ding against the side of the chamber before being thrown his way. He leapt up, taking Palpatine square in the jaw before gripping the saber in mid-air and igniting the crimson blade. Anakin raised it to his chest and charged Palpatine. They connected again and again. Sidious tried using Anakin's family to disarm his opponent mentally, but it only made him focus. The rage made him stronger, and his desire to protect his family made him an impossible foe. Anakin grabbed Palpatine's robes and threw him across the room, and sliced through the floor before connecting again. Skywalker punished Palpatine's defenses, using every ounce of his training to beat his smaller opponent. Sidious was able to seize a weakness in Anakin's defense by puncturing Anakin's stomach with a vile strike, but the rage inside of Skywalker did not stop him. He trapped Palpatine's neck against the wall with his bare hand, and in using all of his physical strength, he slowly and painfully crushed Palpatine's windpipe before disarming the dead body and removing the head. Anakin would fall backwards, holding his side as he pulled the saber out of it. He was lucky. The strike wasn't as precise as Maul's was with Qui-Gon. He would survive, but he needed to get medical attention immediately or he wouldn't. Luckily, Ahsoka and Obi-Wan busted down the door after the two Crimson Sabers extinguished. As it turns out, Bail had seen Anakin rush into the Chancellor's office, and figured he'd contact Obi-Wan to see if he knew that Anakin was back, which he didn't know. Kenobi and Ahsoka went to the building to surprise Anakin. When they arrived though, they heard a commotion, which is why they were here. Ahsoka would get Anakin to a medic, and Obi-Wan would conduct a short investigation based on what Anakin said before he was taken away. In the communication device, Obi-Wan would find Vulu Vant's contact information, which would alleviate any concerns for the Jedi and Anakin's actions today. Anakin was protecting the Republic from its Chancellor, because clearly Palpatine was using the rebel movement to gain more power. It would result in another short-term recession, but with a true government and support for said government, the people could patiently wait these things out. Before Vulu Vant made his final move, the Sith would find destruction. Barriss, who hated the way of the Sith, would betray Violam the night after Palpatine's death. The Sith prospect would be killed in his sleep, and Barriss would return to the temple with the information. Expecting to be sent back to jail, she'd be surprised when it was Counselor Anakin Skywalker who suggested she do some community service and return as a knight, like Ahsoka. The Council decided to rally behind Master Skywalker, as this was his first and last official act as a Jedi Master. He would announce his retirement following Barriss's reintroduction into the Order. He'd be open about why, and ask that the Council, Ahsoka, and even Barriss come to visit his family on Naboo for a celebration of life and triumph over the Sith. The Council would accept these terms. They just wanted to see what happened with Vulu Vant before doing so. The Skakawan board member sought revenge against Palpatine because he now knew the truth. But now, the self-deprecating man decided that he would never win this war because he didn't want to fight it anyways, and he cut his losses. He had accepted the status quo because he wanted to kill Palpatine for killing all of his friends, or capturing them. While he couldn't accomplish his own revenge, it was finished. He would never control territory, and he didn't want to, so in fear, he waddled away into the unknown regions, where he would colonize lost worlds and become his own mini-dictator. It made him feel powerful, which means it accomplished everything he set out to do. Eventually, the Jedi Council would be able to join Anakin at the villa for a celebration of life. Yoda would be totally infatuated with the twins, because he could see how happy they made Anakin and Padme. He jokingly remarked that he wanted to hear about them as they grew up, because while he wanted them to be Jedi, he knew they never would be, which was totally fine. The Jedi were accepting of Anakin's decision, and they were also very happy for him, because his life was the way it needed to be. Plus, he did what the prophecy said. He brought balance to the Force. The Skywalkers would remain on Naboo for the rest of their lives, but the twins would be exposed to everything, from Jedi practices to being the few citizens ever welcomed inside the temple whenever they wanted. The Council almost allowed Anakin to remain a master due to his prowess of walking between light and dark without totally collapsing into the dark side. Mace was the one that suggested that, but Anakin, thankful for the kindness, rejected it, preferring to enjoy his simple life. A man of his talents, living on a villa? That was a good way to go. The twins wouldn't have any other siblings, but they would grow up to be huge public servants. Like the Jedi, they'd be known for humanitarian work. Same would go for Padme and Anakin. Senator Amidala would be crucial in saving the Republic this second time around, and there would be thousands of more checks and balances on the executive branch to make sure they never let a Palpatine rise again. In the end, Padme and Anakin would grow their relationship to be stronger than ever before. They, with their big happy family, which included dozens of friends from Jedi to senators, would live out the rest of their lives, shared in peace and in love. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, There Are Cars, The Shade of Fear, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Alexander Arisa Beginning and End, Django Fat Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sirwell in 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo 670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jenny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Mad Meta Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Main 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So, really weird thing with Palpatine here, but I really wanted to try something where Palpatine kind of elongates the war. I typically don't go this route because I'm kind of a firm believer that Palpatine would be okay with cutting the loss of Anakin. And in this scenario, he doesn't do that. In this scenario, he's more or less focused on bringing Anakin to the dark side. And by doing that, he elongates the war by politically manipulating everything, which I thought was a lot of fun to do. And I think it actually would have worked out in a scenario where Anakin didn't go back to Coruscant. I also had a couple different ideas for how the final fight would go. I thought it'd be interesting to have Anakin kind of like go full dark side, a little bit of Luke Return of the Jedi kind of vibe, where he just absolutely loses his cool and just goes like psycho. And I think that works in this scenario. And more or less, I really wanted the focus of the story, aside from the whole galactic scale events, to be Anakin and Padme just actually being a healthy relationship, spending, like, it all happens the way their marriage happened. It happens on a whim. They're like, oh, let's go to Naboo. Okay, let's do it. And they do it on a whim. And it actually works out because they spend time on Naboo and actually, get to work on being a couple. So, happy times for everyone. I hope you all enjoyed the story. I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, friends, may the Force be with you.